Qajuqturvik's work goes well beyond a traditional soup kitchen, because we recognize that we have a really unique opportunity to support and build relationships with our community members because we share meals with them.
That was Rachel Blais, the Executive Director of the Qajuqturvik Community Food Center in Iqaluit, Nunavut. Today, Rachel will speak to the food center's holistic approach towards addressing food insecurity in Iqaluit and the ways in which the center reaches those with disabilities and fosters community and belonging. Welcome to Growing Together, a podcast that covers a range of topics on food, food security, and disability. I am Maya Nelson-Roundtree, your host, and this podcast is brought to you by the Disabled Independent Gardeners Association. Before starting, we would like to acknowledge that we are calling in today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I hope you enjoy today's episode of Growing Together. So how did you become involved within the Qajuqturvik Community Food Center?
Qajuqturvik was actually the first place that I volunteered at when I first moved to Iqaluit 3 years ago. The organization's programs really caught my eye, and it seemed like a really great central meeting space in a community that lacks a lot of open, accessible community spaces. And as someone with a background in development and globalization, Qajuqturvik's work was completely in line with what I think is a progressive and holistic approach towards addressing food insecurity.
So you mentioned that you have lived in Iqaluit for 3 years. Mm-hmm. From your experience living there and through your experience in the food center, how would you describe the state of Iqaluit with regards to food insecurity?
So I'm actually going to reference, there's an Inuit organization called ITK, or Inuit Tepirit Kanatami, excuse my very poor pronunciation. They released a strategy earlier this summer, and it was called the Inuit Nunavut Food Security Strategy. And they described food insecurity in Inuit Nunavut, or the Inuit homelands in Canada, as the longest lasting public health emergency in Canada and Canadian history. So I try to stay away from statistics in these kinds of conversations because they can so often remove the humanity and empathy from the situation. But I will note this one because it's really stark, and it relays a lot of the government inaction that has led to this current state. So ITK found that in Nunavut, 77.6% of adult Inuit are currently experiencing food insecurity. That statistic doesn't take into account the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it gives a glimpse into what the situation is in Nunavut. And I think when people from other areas in Canada hear about food insecurity in the north, I think the common thought is, well, you can't grow food there, so of course it must be extremely expensive to feed a family. For reference, on average, food prices here are 2 to 3 times the national average. And I think that a lot of people think of the north as this one giant food desert. And it's really important to remember that there is a local food system in Nunavut, and this local food system has sustained its people for thousands of years. And the Canadian government's attempted destruction of this food system and its replacement with a reliance on a Southern food system that, Southern foods often have low nutritional value when compared to the nutrient-dense country foods that are readily available here in Nunavut. And that is a big part of the conversation when we're talking about food insecurity in Nunavut. And although food insecurity amongst Inuit in Nunavut is the highest of any population in Canada, I think it's also really important to talk about the hunters around the territory who are doing immense work to address food insecurity in their communities, and they're doing it with little to no government support. Country food is still a large part of Inuit diets and culture. Many Inuit still get a quarter to a half of their protein from country foods. And support for this local food system and the hunters and harvesters who have kept it strong despite this attempted destruction is essential to addressing food insecurity in Nunavut. And I also want to say, like, I think it's an important part of the conversation is like a broader conversation about emergency food access programs, like traditional soup kitchens and food banks. And like Qajuqturvik actually started as a soup kitchen. And services like soup kitchens and food banks became regular parts of urban centers in Canada during the 1930s and then again in the 1980s. And these charity services were meant to be temporary emergency food access measures, and they do nothing to address the root causes of food insecurity. But these models are still heavily relied on here in Iqaluit. And as food insecurity is so urgent, right, in this community and in this territory. But there has been progress in recent years, including here at Qajuqturvik. So in the last few years, our organization has adopted the Community Food Centers Canada model. So this model focuses on food access, food skills, and advocacy work. And these pillars seek to address the root causes of food insecurity here in the North. And, we see this not only at Qajuqturvik, but it's efforts like these to make changes on a systemic level that is so crucially important to addressing food insecurity in Nunavut.
Yeah. You were speaking to the local food system in Nunavut. Could you briefly describe the local food system there?
Yeah, so the local food system here, we call them country food. They are traditional Inuit foods that are hunted by harvesters in the territory. And so it consists mostly of animal products, marine and land animals, as well as some foraging of plants during the summer months. But this system, consists of, depending on the region, but like some of the most common country foods are Arctic char, or seal, or narwhal and beluga called muktuk, or caribou, muskox, animals that have sustained Inuit here for thousands of years. And the knowledge that the hunters and harvesters carry to successfully and safely hunt these animals, has been passed down through generations. And it's crucially important that it continues to be passed down to future generations, because the local food system here is very much tied to Inuit culture. There's a lot of traditional knowledge and language and relationships and connections that are supported and passed on to future generations through the local food system. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, so just focusing more on the Qajuqturvik Community Food Center, could you describe what the food center is, specifically around the programs that you offer?
So Qajuqturvik Community Food Center strives to increase health, belonging, and food sovereignty in Iqaluit. We offer a range of programming that focuses on food access, food skills, and advocacy work. So this programming includes a daily community meal that's offered to community members 5 days a week, a healthy food box program that is equitably distributed on a sliding scale, a pre-employment training program, cooking classes for kids and youth, as well as a peer advocacy program. So our vision is, a territory that has achieved food sovereignty and food security in Nunavut.
As you mentioned, you're saying that you definitely don't want to just address like the urgent food security and access needs. And through all your programs, I saw that you also emphasize like education and engagement. And could you tell me what role you believe education and engagement has in achieving food sovereignty in Nunavut?
Absolutely. So education and engagement is important at Qajuqturvik because of our focus on food sovereignty, and education and engagement are extremely tied to food sovereignty. So when people are free to define and create a food system that works for them, in order to do that, they need to have the position, the confidence, and the knowledge to advocate for themselves. So self-determination is key to food sovereignty, and education and engagement about the food system in Nunavut is key to being able to advocate for oneself. And empowerment is hard to achieve without education and engagement, I think. These things provide the tools to give someone the knowledge and confidence to use their voice to affect change on an individual and an institutional level, and to also ensure that these changes aren't done from the top down. So in everything that we do at Qajuqturvik, because we do want to address like the root causes of food insecurity, we acknowledge that without a well-informed and motivated and engaged community, our efforts really can only go so far without the full cooperation and motivation and movement from our community members, which can only really authentically be done in an informed way.
Yeah. What kind of information is taught within these programs, these educational programs?
Yeah, so I mean, our food skills program, we focus a lot on just like basic knowledge about food preparation and handling, helping people to feel more confident and autonomous in the kitchen, and when handling food and serving community or serving family members or whatever that might look like, even in the workplace, but also having conversations about the food system and about the importance of supporting hunters and the ties to food insecurity and poverty, to give people the information and the tools that they need to join us in advocating at all levels of government, to advocate for policy that will create substantial change in our communities. Yeah, and then we also have our peer advocacy program. So that is, we have a peer advocacy coordinator, and she connects with people to help them navigate a lot of barriers that they may experience when accessing government support, or seeking employment, or like a lot of the language and mobility and technological barriers that a lot of people face when accessing mental health support or whatever it might be. And so part of that program as well is educating people not only on food, but their right to food, and their right to culturally appropriate foods, and nutritious foods. And that's a really important part of the equation here, is resisting this reliance on emergency food access programs by also educating people on their autonomy and their rights and their cultural rights and their rights as Indigenous people to have foods that support their culture and their history.
Yeah, it seems like you're taking a really all-encompassing approach, which is so great. Mm-hmm. It's my understanding that the food center also regularly serves community members who have disabilities. So from your perspective, what unique barriers are experienced by people with disabilities within Nunavut with regards to food security?
I mean, so firstly, there's the physical inaccess that, acts as a really big barrier to people or to Nunavummiut who are experiencing disability. Whether that's accessing transportation to get to a grocery store, or the lack of paved sidewalks or shoveled walkways, a lack of accessible infrastructure like wheelchair ramps that are shoveled regularly. There are so many physical barriers for folks to access healthy, affordable food in Iqaluit. And I think it's fair to say that, like most infrastructure in the world, the infrastructure in Nunavut isn't designed with people who are experiencing disability in mind. So navigating the systems and accessing essential spaces like food access spaces very difficult. But then, there's also the higher likelihood that someone who's experiencing disability is also experiencing poverty. In a place like Nunavut, where food costs are 2 to 3 times the national average, This creates immense economic barriers for Nunavut with disabilities to access nutritionally dense and culturally appropriate foods.
Yeah, so how does the Qajuqturvik Community Food Center work to reach those with disabilities and those most vulnerable to experiencing food insecurity?
So we know that food insecurity, poverty, and disability are often linked. Folks who are experiencing disability are more likely to experience poverty and therefore more likely to be food insecure. And likewise, without access to nutritionally dense, affordable food, people are more likely to develop chronic illnesses and other disabilities. And someone is more likely to experience food insecurity if they lack economic and physical access to healthy food. So to reach people who are at most risk of experiencing food insecurity, we make sure that our programs are accessible to community members physically and economically. So for instance, our weekly healthy food box program is equitably available to community members on a sliding scale to ensure that all community members can participate in the program regardless of income level. We were even offering delivery in the community for some time, but unfortunately we had to suspend that due to some staffing issues from the pandemic. But we focus on employment and skill building opportunities for our community members because, again, we know that increased income decreases reliance on food access programs. And then we also have our pre-employment training program, for which many of our participants have experienced disability, and our peer advocacy program that helps people prepare resumes and look for jobs and look for jobs that pay a living wage specifically, or apply for college programs. We try to break down any barriers that people are experiencing, and whether that is people who are experiencing disability or people who are able-bodied. So although our programs aren't specifically for people who are experiencing disability, many of the community members who participate in our programs are experiencing disability. And much of the work that we do at Qajuqturvik seeks to address poverty, as this affects so many aspects of people's lives, including Nunavut who are experiencing disability. And we know that the best way to address poverty is through direct income supports. So we've seen the evidence of this at QCFC during the pandemic, as our numbers dropped drastically when CERB first became available and steadily went back up as restrictions to the program made it more difficult for people to access. So likewise, we had a local Inuit organization, Qajuqturvik Inuit Association, QIA, distributed grocery vouchers to all beneficiaries in Iqaluit, and we saw our numbers plummet again. So, we know that direct, adequate, and accessible income assistance is crucial to addressing poverty, and keeping in mind that, folks who are experiencing disability are more likely to be experiencing poverty, of course. The community members that we serve who experience disability are at the forefront of, the community members that we are seeking to serve as they are experiencing food insecurity.
When learning more about the food center, I saw that you have, I don't know if these numbers are still correct, but like 80 daily visitors with 56,000 meals served annually with hundreds of participants in your programs, as well as volunteers. So yeah, these are definitely not small numbers. So can you share with us the impacts that this work has had on the community?
This year is a little bit hard to gauge because a lot of our programs have been suspended or interrupted, or just shifted during the pandemic to make sure that everyone is safe. But the numbers are still about the same overall. But it's interesting, like beyond the daily community meal, like you mentioned, over 50,000 meals served in 2020. Like Qajuqturvik's work goes well beyond a traditional soup kitchen. Because we recognize that we have a really unique opportunity to support and build relationships with our community members because we share meals with them. And although, folks may participate in our food access programs to access nutritious foods, what they'll find at Qajuqturvik serves them in so many other ways. Our food skills program, offer chances to gain confidence with handling and preparing food. while also, offering opportunities to gain skills to re-enter the workforce. Our advocacy program offers assistance with navigating government and system supports that are often designed to create barriers for the people that are trying to access them. And, our peer advocacy coordinator supports community members as they access social assistance and poverty reduction programs in an attempt to empower community members to navigate the systems that are inherently designed to limit their opportunities. And, we hope that community members find a welcoming and supportive environment at Qajuqturvik. And we hope that they leave with the support and the tools that they need to advocate for their needs.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Is there any specific story or anything that you could share with how your food center has impacted an individual or a family?
I mean, there are a lot.
There's so many, I'm sure.
I think, when people come to Qajuqturvik, they come into a community. People have built friendships and connections and support systems at the food center, whether with staff or with other community members. It's such an important gathering space, like I mentioned, in a community that doesn't have many open community gathering spaces. As far as a specific story, we did an annual survey last year, where a lot of people were reporting that Qajuqturvik was their only source of country foods, for instance, that a lot of people were accessing country food from a regular basis at Qajuqturvik, and how important that was for their own, sense of self and identity and connection to culture. So that's something that we're really proud of, and something that we're, steadily increasing. Our goal is to eventually get to a point where the only meats that we use in our daily meal are country food. So that's a long-term goal for us, but we are making strides towards it. But yeah.
Rachel just spoke to the ways in which food insecurity in Iqaluit and throughout Nunavut is stark, however strongly supported by the local food system that has been able to sustain the Inuit people for generations. She also spoke to the ways in which the Qajuqturvik Community Food Center reaches those with disabilities through accessible programs, as well as its all-encompassing work towards food sovereignty in Nunavut. Thank you for listening. This podcast was kindly supported by Ingenium, Canada's Museums of Science and Innovation. Stay tuned for more episodes of Growing Together.